Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Bennington, and I'm so thrilled to be here today with my friend and professional coach, Debra Hickok of Featherstone Personal and Professional Coaching. Debra has coached leaders at the top of business, government, and sports, and she works with me on Awake Exec, and she's going to be my co-facilitator for the upcoming Ready to Lead course. We're so thrilled to have her here. Thank you, Debra, for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. So we are going to dive into the four questions. And what I'm so intrigued about in regards to this conversation is the fact that these four questions can really help you move with grace and ease through any of life's challenges, whether they be professional, personal, whatever. And so, shall we just dive in?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
So it's interesting that you talk about, Emily, your experience with the questions, because this is what I ended up uncovering over the past, many years, where I would either be studying or attending a training or going through some kind of a mindfulness experience. And I found that so many different teachers, instructors, guides, whether in the field of psychology in some cases or more related directly to mindfulness, I kept encountering the questions, and they might be customized a little bit. I've seen them done a little differently in business settings for specific issues happening at work. But I realized how universal and relatable they are, and that, as you say, they can make such a huge difference in how we become present and how we respond to different situations. And that's when I began to really kind of hybridize them and use them in my coaching and facilitation in lots of different ways. So,
Now,
yeah.
did you call them the four questions? Did you coin that term, or is that what you heard? Because there's something sort of mysterious about it,
You're right.
right?
Yeah. Um, Let me think about this. I know that in a number of my trainings, and there are a lot of, teachers who, I'm thinking if it might have come from Byron Katie. Byron Katie calls her four questions the work. She
Mm-hmm.
actually has, that's her name. And I think actually she might also have the phrase, because I've had the privilege of sitting with her and going to her trainings and reading her books and all that. And she may call it the four questions. Other people, Jack Kornfield and other mindfulness teachers say there are four questions. There's a wonderful woman who is someone who teaches mindfulness with eating, and she refers to either the questions or four questions
Mm-hmm.
around your relationship with food. So I don't, I didn't coin it, and I don't really know who or that anybody has.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always just referred to it as the four questions, and I always make it clear that I have really pulled these and I have hybridized them, and I sort of apply them depending on the situation I'm in, making it very clear that I have encountered them over and over again in different iterations, but they always seem to be very similar. The four questions always end up being very similar kinds of questions in some way.
Cool. So let's dive in. What is the first question?
So the first question is about really being with what is already there. And this is something that is harder than it may seem because most of us are not aware of this. So when we have something happening that is either going on inside of us or in a situation, often our natural inclination or our conditioned inclination is to turn away from it, to resist it, to get into some kind of a story about it. And the first question is being willing to ask yourself, can I just notice what is happening right now? Am I willing to simply be with what is here? So I don't tend to formalize these questions in such a way that they have to be asked very specifically. The first question is, can I just simply notice and name what's going on right now?
Versus getting swept away in it.
Right, right. And it's the very beginning of becoming more present and less triggered or reactive. Because the minute you begin to practice asking yourself this question in any situation that you're in,
Mm-hmm.
what am I experiencing right now? What's
So
going on with me?
So let's put this in a practical setting, practical situation. So you're at home and maybe your son is driving you crazy. you're at work and you have a colleague who is putting tremendous amounts of pressure on you for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
You are frustrated with technology, whatever the situation is, rather than just getting pulled into your thoughts about it or your emotions or your judgments, then the first step is to stop and say, what's going on?
Yes. Yes. What am I experiencing right now? What is happening? And it involves a level of body awareness. It involves letting also your body intelligence let you know, are you clenching? Is your heart racing? Has your breath gotten very shallow? Does your face feel hot? That's a part of noticing what's happening, and as well as noticing what inner dialogue may have just gotten churned up. What am I actually saying to myself now as well? And you're right, the different situations that you've just talked about are perfect examples of how we are very likely, even with just this first question, to insert the tiniest little stopgap if we're new to this experience before we may have a very ingrained, quick reaction. And the reason that I like these questions, I think this is helpful to say up front, is that what I've noticed with a lot of my clients who are new to this, to mindfulness and to conscious leadership, is that it's really helpful to have a practical tool, because people will say to me, well, I know I'm supposed to notice what's going on, but I just don't. I never have. How am I supposed to do that? That's what these questions do. They give you a tool. And just by virtue of asking the question, you immediately get a little distance on what's going on with you and can see it from what mindfulness teachers call, the fair witness stance or the observer. And immediately that alone can begin to bring you a little more present to your whole being and to the situation in a bigger way.
Yeah, I always call it the witness or the watcher, so that you
Yeah.
can watch what's going on in your own mind from almost a third party perspective, even though it's
Right.
you, but
Yeah, I think
you're witnessing what's going on. Okay,
yeah.
so first question, what am I noticing right now? What is
Mm-hmm.
the second question?
So the second question is, can I allow it just to be here? And again, you can see how it unfolds directly out of the first one. Once I've noticed that my heart is racing, I'm getting angry, I'm feeling impatient, I'm getting fearful or anxious, can I, before jumping into any kind of action, can I just allow it? Can I just, different people I study or under whom I've trained talk about it in different ways. They give an example of imagining a bigger space surrounding it. They imagine just a softening happening. It is about being more spacious, and it is about allowing what is happening, not to be confused with caving to a situation that's not appropriate, letting people run over you. It's not about, ironically, it's the opposite ultimately of accepting something that may not be right or maybe unethical. But in order to have a more empowered and appropriate response, we actually first just want to make some space for it and not get into any kind of action right away.
And that's where people go wrong, right? I mean, that's where I see, particularly in business, where people do the most damage to their reputation is when they take an action too early without making space for what it is that they're feeling. So they're reacting to that initial gut, right?
Right.
That initial gut
Right.
response.
Right.
And then they look back and say, oh, geez, I shouldn't have behaved that way. And at that point, it's too late. Right. At that point, it's just
well,
it's too late.
you can't undo that particular response, but I think, not to put too fine a point on it, Emily, but in mindfulness, we wouldn't even necessarily say the response was wrong. We might just say, they haven't availed themselves or learned about another way to do this. And you're right, you can't, that horse is out of the barn in that situation, but who knows if there can be some damage control. But the idea would then be, if they're interested and willing, which of course is what's required, an openness to another way of doing things. We are seeing this kind of mindfulness being brought into all kinds of very, very high level corporations now, and very data-based people are becoming very interested in how this helps in corporate settings and work settings. So if someone is open to exploring another way, the age-old question, how's the current way working for you? this can be something that can really help people learn how to have a much more thoughtful response to tough situations.
Yeah, one of the phrases that I love is when in doubt, play it out.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about, the long-term ramifications of your actions versus just moving forward with what you're feeling in that moment. And
Right.
so I think that by making that space, creating that space, you allow yourself to play out, oh, well, what would happen if I did this? And what would happen if I went with this reaction and whatnot? So you're able to evaluate better. So,
Right.
so first question is, what's going on here? Can I
Yeah.
notice it? Second
Yeah.
question is, can I make room for it? Can I make space
Right.
for it? What is the
Right.
third question?
And so the third question is, can I bring some compassion or kindness to what I am actually experiencing? Because it's very typical when we are experiencing something really uncomfortable or what some people consider negative feelings or emotions or thoughts. It's not very natural, unfortunately, for many of us to then to be kind to ourselves, perhaps kind to another person, or to bring a certain compassionate perspective to the whole situation. This can be, and I see often with my clients, this is where it gets a little tough because it can feel like a tall order. And so what we can do when we're struggling with one of the questions like this one, I've had many clients say to me, Deborah, that feels like a really big jump. I mean, I'm learning to notice it and even bring some acceptance in without jumping into action. Now you want me to actually, be compassionate.
Be kind.
Yes. And I think it also gets, again, a little misinterpreted. That does kindness mean telling, someone at work that what they've done, or even interpersonally, that what they've done is okay? The whole idea of this process, Emily, is that, and I see it all the time with my work and in my own personal life, is that we can get to a place where we can express very powerful boundaries and actually be saying, this absolutely isn't going to work for me, or even fire someone if necessary, with compassion and kindness.
And I love what
yeah,
you said. We talked about this in an Awake Exec roundtable and one of the things that I remember from that just really that spoke to me was you said that correcting someone's behavior is sometimes one of the most compassionate things that you can do. Can you touch on that a little bit? Because I think that may seem strange to people.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to just clarify and thank you for the question. I appreciate that. So yeah, it's a really empowering concept when people get it and plug into it. But I would say with the language that it's not about correcting someone's behavior, because we can never do that. We can never actually correct another person's behavior. But I know what you mean, and I know what you're talking about, but I want to just language it a little more clearly because I think it's important. I wouldn't want someone to think it's actually about thinking we can correct that other person. But what we can do is by getting more clear through asking ourselves these questions, what is happening in that moment? Because we are going to get a better sense at a more true level, a more authentic level of what's actually happening in a situation when we can drop below a triggered reaction or a story that just kicked in or heated emotion. So what can happen is we may not ever be able to correct another person, but we can give expression to our response, to a boundary, to something difficult that we may need to highlight with another person, that then gives them an opportunity to make a change if they would like to. And that's where the space opens up for another person to make a change. That when we tend to actually attempt to correct someone, which often can involve shaming them or having some kind of an agenda or a level of resistance in our tone or our energy, most human beings, just by nature, are not going to respond well to that. And so the opportunity for corrected behavior gets very, very small, because who isn't going to protect themselves if they feel that kind of onslaught? But if we keep coming from noticing what's happening, being more spacious, and then bringing in compassion or kindness, which I want to point out because you brought this to my attention and asked me a great question around the third question, Emily, that I think would be great to bring in here, which is you said, you know, why is compassion important in work and leadership situations? And I think to plug that in here, which is there's a greater window of opportunity for someone to correct or change their behavior when we speak to them from an authentic, interconnected way. You know, when we speak to someone as a person who is in the humanity pool with them. Authentic leadership, authentically talking to someone about something really tough, brings in a possibility for them to maybe hear you. It just opens the window as wide as possible. And ultimately, if they correct their behavior, that's going to be up to them. But compassion is about a level of connection with other people, not particularly, but including at work, where they feel that you actually see them when you are talking with them.
Yeah, and I think that that is a trait that is desperately needed in business today, because I think that there has been an image of leadership that has been painted as when you're the leader, you have to be cool, you have to have all the answers, you have to know exactly what to say and when. And one of the things that I loved about listening to Brene Brown this year was she said, quit trying to be cool. Yeah. Cool is the emotional straitjacket, which makes you less available for connection, which in turn makes you less available for leadership roles. And I was just like, oh, yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, and she calls what I also like in terms of how she's coined a few words is, you know, she calls perfectionism a hustle. You know, it's a self-protective armor. But really it's like you're in a constant con game, you know, because it's not possible. And I think one of the perspectives that we can get in with question number 3, which is, can I bring in not only some compassion toward maybe what's going on with me as the leader or the manager in this case, and even better, what's going on with this other person that makes for a really great leader. What can happen is, like you just said, we learn with these questions to be in our humanity as a leader. So one of the things that can be an upshot of doing this process is people learning to build in a little toolkit that they may need because they're starting to notice what's going on. So someone might say, if possible, you know, I need to call you back in a few minutes. Excuse me, I'm going to step out to the restroom. I'll be back. They may just want to get up from the chair at the conference table and stretch for a minute. And always, you know, we teach everybody to take deep breaths, which can be done very subtly during a meeting.
Because this isn't something that you need to say, excuse me, I'm going to bring some compassion to the situation now, right? So you're not actually going to that level.
That may not go over too well, right?
Yeah. But you just, within your own mind.
Yes. And it can bring, like I say, a level of accessibility and humanity to even just the way you're comporting yourself with the people you're managing and leading and with your peers and colleagues. There is just a level of humanity that really does get ushered in when we learn to, you know, really kind of give ourselves a break and give other people a break, even if you are letting them know this is going to have to change. You may not be able to even stay here if it doesn't, but there's a level of, it's not this, you know, do or die, holy grail, you know, level of perfectionism. And I think question number 3 is really what helps with that, is the compassion and the kindness, because we're all in the human tribe and no one's doing it perfectly.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. And I think another point that you've made on this topic that I want to touch on is that it's sometimes very, very difficult to bring full compassion to a situation, particularly if it's one where you feel particularly frustrated, you feel betrayed in some way.
Yes.
You're bumping up against excessive anger. However, it is enough to just, in your own words, be able to just touch it with compassion.
Right.
And I think that's a really important point to make. It's not that you have to envelop the whole situation in loving kindness, but if you can just touch it, particularly with compassion, particularly when you're just getting started, that's enough, right?
It is absolutely enough. And I'm so glad that you highlighted that. And you and I have talked about this. We've been chatting a lot about, the chemical leak lately and, which has happened where you live. And we've talked about the anger there. And it's very hard to be compassionate toward people who let that happen. I mean, this is a process. And I'm glad you brought it up, because not only is it perfectly great if you can just touch a little compassion. And I've seen situations where just in learning this process, someone just might get the tiniest glimpse into a person, for example, at their job, and or even when I coach some people interpersonally, where they start out with this little glimpse of understanding that that person is in all of their self-protective stuff too, and they're not consciously or purposely trying to hurt another person or sabotage anything. They're kind of at their own level of consciousness. That's really what compassion is about, is understanding that people are kind of at whatever level of consciousness they're at, or they would be behaving differently. They absolutely would be.
And there's a great quote that's, you don't forgive because the other person deserves forgiveness. I mean, sometimes you forgive because the other person deserves forgiveness, but the quote is, forgive because you deserve peace. And that, I think, speaks to this. It's not so much that you're giving compassion because the other person deserves it. And to touch on your point earlier, for those who don't know, I live in Charleston, West Virginia, which just recently went through a situation where a local business leaked 7,500 gallons of a toxic chemical into our water system, which just basically meant that we have been living on bottled water for the last 10 days. So this is real stuff. You're approaching real life, real situations, and I think sometimes when you use the word compassion, some people may tune it out as like, oh, that's la-di-da-di, and it doesn't affect real business.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I have learned through this process and through this going through these questions with myself is that when I approach thinking about how angry I am, how mad I am at this company in this situation, when I can approach it with compassion, then it's not so much that I'm letting them off the hook, it's that I'm able to process the situation better and as a result, respond to it better, right? So I think that's, unless you had a follow-up point, I think that leads us to question 4, right?
It does. I wanted to drop one quick little point in when you said it's okay just to touch something with compassion. And what I'd like to just drop in there before we move on, because it's important, is sometimes, and it's perfectly natural, we can't get even a pinhead of compassion. We just can't get to that third step for, a long time. It takes time. And I have clients who have said to me, I just can't do that right now. I can't come up with any compassion or kindness. And what I want to make sure people understand is that we hang out with whatever question in the process is accessible to us in that moment. And if only a little tiny part of question 1, because we're so new to all of this, we can even only get to that. This process is so personal, Emily, that I want to make sure people know that you may take this one question at a time for as long as you may need to, and people tend to know when they can kind of start to embody the next question.
That's a really good point, Deborah, because you can hang out in question 2 about making space for something for as much or as little time as you need, and for some people it could be days, for some people it could be hours, for some people it could be months, and the point is that that's okay.
It sure is. Yeah.
Okay, so question 4.
So question 4 is where we can get into a more empowered choice at this point, and this is where meaningful action will actually come forward if needed. So the last question is, in light of the first 3, what have I noticed is happening? Making some space and coming into just some acceptance with no action at that point, and then seeing if I can maybe bring in a little bit of softness, a little bit of compassion here, if possible. The last question is, what needs to happen now? Or what is it that I want to or need in this moment? So it's then opening the questions up to a potential action or a choice. I mean, the action could be inaction. You know, this happens to me often where what I realize by taking myself through this process is that it's actually inaction that my choice. I'm not going to send that email or make that phone call right now. I'm going to wait before I let that organization know that I actually do want to help them with this project or do another volunteer gig. So, or it could be very empowered action. I now really know what I have to do in this situation, and it's not going to be easy, but I'm so much more clear. So question 4, what needs to happen now? And now means often right in this minute. So if we know we're in a high heat meeting at work and we need to slow the cadence down, or we need to call for a little break, we're going to take a 5-minute break, or I just need to get into some deep breathing, that can also lead to a later action that is going to be more conscious and deliberate. So that's kind of the getting into choice question. Now what's needed?
Mm-hmm. And because you've gone through steps 1 through 3, when you get to step 4, then you can rest assured that that action will be more wise, more strategic, more logical, more thoughtful, more calm.
Right. Absolutely. And in fact, I recently was in a situation where I went through this process. And again, I want people to know that it's like anything else. It gets more fluid, more natural. It's not, because I could see people saying, you think I'm going to be in some, situation where I'm going to be able to pause and take myself through this, what might feel like an unwieldy process. These become very natural questions. They just become something that happens almost like breathing. It's like anything else when you want to become more empowered and more grounded. It takes practice. It takes practice. But I remember, I went through the questions, and the fourth question, the way it can work sometimes is, I'm not going to do anything, because I had to skip over question 3 because I can't get any sense of compassion right now toward maybe this person that I need to have an interaction with. So you can still get to some sense of what's needed. You really can, if you've engaged noticing and being with and a conscious choice not to act too quickly. For me, I couldn't quite get to compassion, and I gave myself a few days before I acted, because whenever we can do that, I think it's really helpful. And then I was able to get in. So the first action was, I'm not going to do anything because I don't have any compassion on board. And then the action later was a more compassionate action, more even-handed.
I like that. So I never thought about the questions that way. So are you recommending that you don't even take the action until you can find compassion? So until you can work through all of them, you don't take the action. Is that your
I think
general guideline?
Emily, in a perfect world, with that sort of my holy grail recommendation, it would always be that. I mean, if we could always do that, I think it would be wonderful. Now, I want to, again, speaking of, perfectionism being a hustle, I want to make sure people understand that, we start with these questions and we're kind of bumbling around with them, and I think anything that we're doing to try to be more authentic and present and conscious, we need to feel good about that. We need to give ourselves permission to celebrate that we are really trying to be a more empowered and deliberate leader and perhaps human being. And so, ideally, I think what happens is the more we employ these kind of tools in our day-to-day life, the greater the chance we can get to compassion. I mean, I look at some of the mindfulness teachers in my life and some of the incredible mentors who have trained me, and they are so consistently compassionate, and they have been on this road. And I feel that I've been on it a long time, and they've been on it longer. Mm-hmm. They have been on it longer. So my own ability to get to compassion before an action has increased, and I think everybody's does. But I also understand there may be situations where, let's say something happens at work or anywhere interpersonally, and it still doesn't feel exactly like what you would have wanted. Maybe because of question 1 and 2, maybe you slowed down just a little bit. And even if you had to make a quick decision, which we know can happen at work, there can be that kind of pressure. and maybe you look back and say, I didn't do that with a lot of compassion. You may still have done it a little more even-handed, a little more consciously, and just know that that's great. That's a great change, because, that perfect compassion, I would say, is really challenging. It's really, really challenging.
Yeah, particularly when you have lots of volatile emotions involved. But I think that you're right. The more you practice these tools, the more they just become a part of who you are. And it's not so much that you have to sit and think about, okay, well, what's question one? And okay, then question two. So it becomes less of a sequential step process and more of just an integrated part of how you make decisions. And I think that when you can get to that point, and here's the really valuable takeaway in all of this, is that when this becomes part of just who you are and how you make decisions, then you have such increased self-confidence, because you know that you're going to handle situations better, more strategically, more thoughtfully, more calmly, as I mentioned before. So you've got that going on internally, so you're anchored in that way. But when you're making better decisions, what other people pick up on is enhanced executive presence, enhanced leadership presence, which means that you're more apt to be promoted and more apt to be placed in leadership roles, because you can handle the stresses involved in that life.
I think that's a really, really nice summary, Emily. I think it's a great summary. And one word that just popped up just to punctuate it is integrity, integration. Mm-hmm. So leaders who lead with integrity, I think, actually create a lot of safety in their organizations. We use that word a lot in the business of facilitation. But when people feel included, feel seen, there's a safety that develops in the organization, a level of, and I don't mean comfort to do whatever at all. I mean a level of psychological safety that this ship is being, captained by someone who has a really, really solid integrity. And again, so the questions get integrated, and when we see someone leading with integrity, we can watch them make really tough decisions compassionately and with a lot of wisdom and a certain spaciousness and even-handedness that I think comes from this process. So I think you're.
And then you become, and I've mentioned this before, the leader that other people follow because they're compelled and not just because they're being compliant. And it all comes from being a magnificent person first to have a magnificent career. Well, Debra, thank you so very much for your time and your wisdom. Truly appreciate it. And I look forward to working with you on the Ready to Lead course.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here, and I look forward to it too, Emily. Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.